is chapter 24 of Laura Hillenbrand's Unbroken. It starts on page 244. Remember, chapter 23 was called Monster, and in that chapter we're introduced to a new antagonist, the bird. And we found out that the bird is kind of just this really unstable guy who is really violent. He takes pleasure in hurting these prisoners. He's really unpredictable. And he's kind of out to get Louis a little bit. And so now chapter 24, we're going to continue from there with this chapter called Hunted. Here we go. After a day spent shivering in Omori's quarantine area, Louis was led into the main body of the camp, an enormous compound crowded with some 900 prisoners. He wandered down a long row of barracks until he found the one to which he was assigned. As he walked in, several POWs came forward to greet him. One of them slipped a cup of piping hot tea into his chilled hands. A Scottish prisoner approached, carrying a spoon and a bulging sock. He dipped the spoon into the sock and ladled out 2 heaping teaspoons of sugar into Louis's cup. To any POW, sugar was a treasure of incalculable value, and Louis couldn't understand how this man could have acquired an entire sock full of it. As he sipped his tea, Louis was introduced to 2 barracks commanders, British Lieutenant Tom Wade and American Lieutenant Bob Martindale, who began filling him in on Omori. They spoke about the corporal who had attacked him at the gate. His name was Watanabe, they said, but Louis should never refer to him by his real name. Such was Watanabe's paranoia that he often hid outside the barracks, trying to catch men speaking of him so he could beat them for it. The men referred to him by a host of nicknames, including the Animal, the Big Flag, Little Napoleon, and most often the Bird. Note that Napoleon was similarly known for being very power hungry, and so we see the Bird referred to in these ways where he wants more power, because remember, he wanted to be an officer and he didn't become an officer, and that's where a lot of his anger comes from. But mostly they call him the Bird. A name chosen because it carried no negative connotation that could get the POWs beaten, meaning if he hears them calling him the Bird, it's not offensive. It doesn't have any negative or bad, related emotions to it, so they shouldn't get in trouble for it. It was the Bird's favorite pastime to send guards bursting into barracks ahead of him, screaming, "Carry!" He would then race in to choose his victim. Sitting far from the door didn't ensure safety. The Bird loved to leap through open windows. Men were told to always be ready, speak of him only in whispers, and agree in advance on a subject to switch to if the Bird ran into the room, demanding to be told what they were talking about. Men were advised to say they were speaking of sex, because the subject interested and distracted him. So just note here how unpredictable he is and how just crazy paranoid he is, so that the men have to be constantly ready for him to jump in at any time, even through a window. The Omori barracks were arranged in 2 lines separated by a central avenue. At the avenue's end stood the Bird's office, placed so that the corporal could see the entire avenue through his large front window. To get anywhere in the camp other than the benjos, remember bathrooms, behind the barracks, POWs had to step into the Bird's view. One of his demands was that men salute not only him, but his window. He often left the office vacant and hid nearby, baseball bat in hand, ready to club men who failed to salute the window. So not only do you have to salute him, but you also have to salute the window. Sorry, the lawnmower's going outside. Let me take care of that. All right, window closed. We'll see if that helps. Continuing. Among the POWs, there was an elaborate sentry system to monitor the Bird's movements. When he was in his office, men would say, "The animal is in his cage." When he was out, they'd say, "The animal's on the prowl." Flags up meant that the Bird was coming. Men were so attuned to the Bird's presence that they instantly recognized the clopping sounds his clogs made in the sand. The sound usually triggered a stampede to the benjos, where the Bird seldom went. As he absorbed the advice on coping with the Bird, Louis learned something else that surely sank his heart. He had thought that since this was a POW camp, he would be able to write home to let his family know he was alive. Once, Omori POWs had been allowed to write letters, but no longer. The Bird didn't allow it. When new POWs arrived at Omori, they were registered with the Red Cross, and word of their whereabouts was forwarded to their governments, then their families. But Omori officials didn't register Louis. They had special plans for him and were apparently hiding him. In the absence of Louis's names on a Red Cross roster, the American government had no reason to believe that he was alive, and Louis's family was told nothing. For Louis, the shared lessons about the bird did no good. No sooner had Louis stepped outside than the bird found him, accused him of an imaginary infraction, or like an imaginary rule breaking, and attacked him in a wild fury. The next day came another beating, then the next another. Though there were hundreds of POWs in the camp, this deranged, or like crazy off balance in a bad way, corporal was fixated on Louis, hunting the former Olympian, whom he would call number one prisoner. Louis tried to conceal himself in groups of men, but the bird always found him. After the first few days in the camp, Louis said, I looked for him like I was looking for a lion loose in the jungle. When Louis woke each morning, the first thing he thought of was the bird. He'd look through the corporal through morning tenko, roll call, farting at the emperor, and forcing down rations. After breakfast, the enlisted men were assembled into work parties and marched away. With the camp population drastically diminished by the exodus, Louis had no crowds to hide in. The bird was on him immediately. The one good thing about being an officer in Amori was that one was exempt from slave labor, albeit at the painful cost of half the standard ration. Remember, they give more food to the men who are doing this slave labor. Officers don't have to do that work, but then they don't get the extra food. But soon after Louis's arrival, the bird called out the officers and announced that from now on, they'd labor at the work sites alongside the enlisted men, because remember, Louis is an officer. When a man protested that this violated international law, the bird swung his kendo stick straight into the man's head. The bird approached the next man, who also said he wouldn't work. Again, the kendo stick banged down. Louis was the third man. Trying to avoid getting his head cracked open, he blurted out a compromise idea. They'd love to work within the camp, he said, making it a better place. The bird paused. He seemed to feel that as long as he forced the officers to work, he was winning. He sent them into a shack and ordered them to stitch up leather ammunition pouches, backpacks, and equipment covers for the Japanese military. Louis and other men were kept there for about 8 hours a day, but they worked only when the bird was around, and even then they deliberately stitched the leather improperly. Now, you'll start to notice that just like we talked about the importance of maintaining your dignity, having a little bit of rebellion is a way that the prisoners can do this. We've seen that in earlier chapters and at the previous camp. And so here, it's not working when they're not being watched, stitching the leather wrong. Those little acts of rebellion can kind of help the prisoners to maintain their dignity. The bird's next move was to announce that from now on, the officers would empty the benjos. They have to empty the bathrooms. Gross. 8 benjos were no match for 900 dysenteric men. Remember, dysentery means that they're having really intense diarrhea all the time. They're always sick. And keeping the pits from oozing over was a tall order. Louis and the other officers used honey dippers, giant ladles, to spoon waste from the pits into buckets, then carried the buckets to cesspits outside the camp. The work was nauseating and degrading, and when heavy rains came, the waste oozed out of the cesspits and back into the camp. To deprive the bird of the pleasure of seeing them miserable, the men made a point of being jolly. Martindale created the Royal Order of the Benjo. The motto he wrote was unprintable. As the officers finished each day of abuse, honey dipping, and errant suing, the enlisted slaves were driven back to camp. The first time Louis saw them returned, he learned where the stock of sugar had come from. At the work sites, Amori's POWs were waging a guerrilla war. At the rail yards and docks, they switched mailing labels, rewrote delivery addresses, and changed the labeling on boxcars, sending tons of goods to the wrong destinations. They threw fistfuls of dirt into gas tanks and broke anything mechanical that passed through their hands. Forced to build engine blocks, American Milton McMullen crafted the exteriors well enough to pass inspection, but fashioned the interiors so the engines would never run. POWs loading at docks accidentally dropped fragile items, including a large shipment of wine and furniture en route to a Nazi ambassador. The broken furniture was sent on. The wine was decanted into POW canteens, so the prisoners drank it. Coming upon the suitcases of the German envoy, POWs shredded the clothes, soaked them in mud and oil, and repacked them with friendly notes signed Winston Churchill. who is the Prime Minister of England at this point in time. They drank huge quantities of tea and peed profusely on nearly every bag of rice they loaded. And in one celebrated incident, POWs loading heavy goods onto a barge hurled the material down with such force that they sank the barge, blocking a canal. After a Herculean, Greek allusion to Hercules, after a Herculean effort was put into clearing the sunken barge and bringing in a new one, the POW sank it too. So again, we start to see the prisoners finding ways to rebel, even though they're trapped, even though they have very limited resources. They're trying to rebel and help the Allied or the American war effort rather than just right out in the open helping Japan, as they're being ordered to do. Oh, sorry about that. Pause. Here we go. I needed a drink of my tea and my video didn't pause, so carrying on. Emboldened by the thought that he was probably going to die in Japan and thus had nothing to lose, McMullen joined several other POWs in committing an act that was potentially suicidal. While enslaved at a rail yard, they noticed that a group of track workers had neglected to put their tools away. When their guard became absorbed in wooing a pretty girl, the POWs sprinted from their stations, snatched up the tools, dashed over to a section of track, wrenched the pins and bolts out, and rushed back to their work. The guard, still talking to a girl, noticed nothing. A switch engine chugged in, pulling several boxcars. The engine hit the sabotage strip, the rail shot out from under it, and the entire train tipped over. No one was hurt, but the Japanese were frantic. They looked to the POWs, who kept working, their faces devoid of expression, so they just looked like nothing happened. The Japanese began screaming accusations at one another. Now, this next passage is really important. Think about the ways that this ties into what we've talked about maintaining your humanity and your dignity. As dangerous as these acts were, for the POWs, they were transformative. In risking their necks to sabotage their enemy, the men were no longer passive captives. They were soldiers again. So they were no longer just captives who were passive, meaning not taking action. They're not just sitting there being stuck and trapped and imprisoned. They're soldiers. They're getting to fight against their captors, and that feels really good. What the POWs couldn't sabotage or destroy or break, they stole. They broke into shipping boxes, tapped bottles, lifted storage room doors off their hinges, raided ship's galleys, and crawled up factory chutes. Scottish POWs who worked in the Mitsubishi food warehouse ran the most sophisticated operation. When the Japanese took their shoe sizes for work boots, the men asked for boots several sizes too big. They knitted special socks, some 4 feet long, and hoarded hollow bamboo reeds. Once at the sites, they leaned casually against sugar stacks, stabbed the reeds in, then ran the reeds into the socks, allowing sugar to pour through the reeds until the socks were full. So they have these giant boots and these giant socks and then these kind of tubes of bamboo. And so they funnel the sugar into their socks so they can just walk away with it. Others tied up their pant cuffs, stuck the reeds in their waistbands, and filled their pants with sugar. Each load was deposited in a secret compartment in the latrine to be retrieved at day's end. Latrine is bathroom. Each evening, Louis saw the slaves tramping back in, their clothes packed with booty. Booty, think like pirate booty, so it's like the sugar goods that they stole. The critical moment came when inspection was called. Men would deftly or swiftly, competently, sneakily pass contraband, the stolen goods, or the men bearing it around during the searches, while the guards' back were turned. McMullen would hide fish in his sleeves. When patted down, he'd hold his arms up and grip the fish tails so they wouldn't slide out. The biggest trick was hiding the POWs who arrived fall down drunk after chugging down any alcohol that they couldn't smuggle. The drunken men were shuffled into the center of the lineup, their shoulders hinged between the shoulders of sober men so they wouldn't pitch face forward into the guards. So not only are they rebelling, but they're really working together in really sneaky and clever ways to make sure that it's definitely the prisoners against the guards. When the men were safely in the barracks, Louis watched them unpack themselves. Under the men's clothes, sugar-filled socks hung from necks or arms, dangled under armpits and down pant legs, in the necks of turtleneck sweaters, in false pockets under hats. 2-foot-long salmon would emerge from under shirts. Louis once saw a thief pull 3 cans of oysters from a single boot. Legs would be swaddled in tobacco leaves. One American built a secret compartment in his canteen, filling the bottom with stolen alcohol, while on top, upon inspection, yielded only water. Men were caught all the time, and when they were, all the men of the work party were beaten with fists, bats, and rifle butts. But the men were fed so little and worked so hard that they felt they had to steal to survive. They set up a university of thievery, in which professors, the most adept thieves, taught the art of stealing. The final exam was a heist. When the men were caught stealing, POW officers suggested that the culprits be transferred to sites that didn't carry food. The Japanese agreed, and the POW officers then replaced the inept thieves, or the thieves that aren't good at stealing, with University of Thievery alumni, so the people who've graduated the university and are good thieves. Though Louis, an officer, had no opportunity to steal, he was quickly integrated into the thieving system, rolling tobacco leaves for drying and putting them up in the secret wall safes to cure. Once the leaves were properly aged, Louis would return to shave them into smokable shreds. Thanks to stealing, a black market with a remarkable diversity of goods flourished in the camp. One group stole all the ingredients for a cake, only to discover upon baking it that the flour was actually cement. Because there were so many men, there wasn't a lot of loot to go around, but everyone benefited in some way. Whenever the thieves had something extra, they gave it to Louis, who still wasn't managing to gain weight. A few times they even smuggled him smoked oysters. Louis devoured them and tiptoed to the fence to pitch the cans into Tokyo Bay. Stolen food, especially the Scotch sugar, was the camp currency, and the sugar barons became the rich men of Amori, even hiring assistants to do their laundry. The Scots drove hard bargains, but they also donated 1/4 of the loot to sick POWs. One night, when he found Frank Tinker deathly ill, Louis waited for the guards to pass, snuck to the Scots barracks, and told them that Tinker was in trouble. The Scots sent Louis back to Tinker with a load of sugar, no charge. Tinker would later say that Louis's sugar run saved my soul. According to Martindale, Tinker wasn't the only man saved. Deaths from illness and malnutrition had once been commonplace, but after the thievery school was created, only 2 POWs died, one from a burst appendix, and in place predicated on degradation, stealing from the enemy won back the men's dignity. So they replaced this life where they were all starving, dying of starvation and malnutrition, and instead they leave behind their life of being degraded by the officer or by the by the guards of the POW camp, and they replace this with stealing, which allows them to feel their dignity again. So it's saving their lives both kind of emotionally and just physically. As the weeks passed, the bird didn't relent on his attacks on Louis. The corporal sprang upon him randomly, every day pounding his face and head. Any resistance from Louis, even shielding his face, would inspire the bird to more violence. Louis could do nothing but stand there, staggering as the bird struck him. He couldn't understand the corporal's fixation on him, and he was desperate for someone to save him. During one of the bird's attacks, Louis saw the camp commander, Kaname Sakaba, step out of his office and look toward him. Louis felt relief, thinking that now that Sakaba had seen this abuse of a POW by a lowly corporal, here at a show camp he'd put a stop to it. But Sakaba watched indifferently, then walked back inside. Subsequent beatings of Louis and of others were no different. Other Japanese officers watched, some looking on approvingly, others looked dismayed. Sometimes when they issued orders, they allowed the bird, a mere corporal, to overrule them right to their faces. According to a camp accountant, Yuichi Hato, this strange situation was the result of a wrinkle in rank. Sakaba was ravenous for a promotion. The appearance of order in his camp and the productivity of his slaves furthered his interests, and Watanabe's brutality was his instrument. So even though the bird, or Watanabe, is not an officer, he's not very high ranking, he's so harsh that the camp runs smoothly because everyone's scared of him, or at least the camp runs semi-smoothly. And so even though Watanabe, the bird, isn't very high ranking, people listen to him because they want the camp to run smoothly so that everyone gets promoted. So that's why the rank, it says there's a wrinkle in the rank. It's kind of funky. While it's unknown whether Sakaba ordered Watanabe to abuse POWs, he obviously approved. According to Hatto, some camp employees were offended by Watanabe's treatment of POWs, but because those acts pleased Sakaba, the bird was untouchable, even by those who outranked him. So Shane, maybe not everyone wanted this to be happening, but because the head guy at the camp is wanting the bird to keep doing what he's doing, no one can reprimand him or get after him. In consequence, the bird flouted his impunity, his untouchability, and virtually ran the camp. He viewed the POWs as his possessions, and he sometimes attacked other Japanese who interacted with him. Watanabe was, said Hatto, not a mere guard, but an absolute monarch or king of POWs at Amori. Some Japanese, including Hatto, tried to help POWs behind Watanabe's back. No one did more than Private Yukichi Kano, the camp's interpreter. When sick men were taken off work duty, losing half their rations, Kano found them easy jobs to keep them officially at work so they could eat enough to get well. When he saw prisoners violating the rules by eating vegetables in the garden area or pocketing mussels at low tide outside the camp, he talked the guards into looking the other way. In winter, he hung blankets along the infirmary walls and scrounged up charcoal to heat the rooms. He snuck sick men away from the sadistic Japanese doctor and into the hands of a POW who was a physician. There was a far braver man than I, wrote POW Pappy Boynton, winner of the Medal of Honor. Kano's heart was being torn out most of the time, a combination of pity for the ignorance and brutality of some of his own countrymen, and a complete understanding of the suffering of the prisoners. But for Louis, the bird's pet project, Kano could do nothing. This is important to note that Laura Hillenbrand brings in some of these other Japanese officers who aren't brutal and who are wanting to follow the rules of war, because we don't want to have a whole book that's against all of Japanese culture, although that is what we read at times because there's such a militaristic culture and it's so against Louis and the American POWs. But there are these Japanese officers who are helping the POWs, and that's important to note here. When Louis saw Red Cross officials being taken on a carefully staged tour of camp, he thought that help had finally arrived. But to his dismay, the bird tailed the officials and stood by, listening intently as POWs answered the officials' questions about life in camp. No POW was foolish enough to answer truthfully, knowing the retribution that would follow. Louis had no choice but to keep his mouth shut. So the Red Cross is coming to check and make sure they're following all of the camp rules, but everyone knows they can't say anything about how bad it is because they'll be beaten later. Louis was on his own. As the attacks continued, he became increasingly angry. His experience in childhood, when bullies had sent him home bloody every day, was repeating itself. His interior world lit up with rage, and he couldn't hide it. Each time the bird lunged for him, Louis found his hands drawing into fists. As each punch struck him, he imagined himself strangling the bird. The bird demanded that Louis look him in the face. Louis wouldn't do it. The bird tried to knock Louis down. Louis wobbled, but wouldn't fall. In his peripheral vision, he could see the bird looking furiously at his clenched fists. Other prisoners warned Louis that he had to show deference, like be respectful, or the bird would never stop. Louis couldn't do it. When he raised his eyes, all that shone in them was hate. To Watanabe, whose life was consumed with forcing men into submission, Louis's defiance was an intolerable personal offense. So just like what happened before Louis found track, when people pick on him, when he's mistreated, he gets angry. And so this is becoming a problem because as Louis is targeted more and more by the bird, he becomes more and more filled with rage and anger. And that makes the bird want to target him even more because Louis is not going to submit to the bird. And so this is like these two are at a standoff and it's going to get nasty. More and more now, the POWs could hear air raid sirens echoing across the bay from Tokyo. They were all false alarms, but they raised the prisoners' hopes. Louis searched the empty sky and hoped that the bombers would come before the bird put an end to him. Note there that Louis is legitimately nervous that he won't survive. He's hoping that the war will end before the bird kills him. At 6:30 Greenwich Mean Time on Wednesday, October 18, 1944, a program called Postman Calls began its evening airing on Radio Tokyo. It was one of 12 propaganda programs conducted in English and broadcast to Allied troops. The broadcasters were POWs known as propaganda prisoners, usually working under threat of execution or beating. This evening, the program made an announcement. This is the postman calling California and Mrs. Louise Zamperini, 2028 Gramercy Street, Torrance, California. Here's a message from her son, First Lieutenant Louis Sylvie Zamperini, now interned in the Tokyo camp. My darling family, I'm uninjured and in good health. I miss you all tremendously and dream of you often, praying that you are all in good health and hope to see you again someday. Love to all relatives and friends. Hold my belongings and money for me. Love, Louis. A few miles away at Amori, Louis knew nothing of the broadcast. The Japanese had written it themselves or forced a propaganda prisoner to do so. So they just broadcast this message like, hey, Louis' family, I'm fine. Louis didn't know they did it. The broadcast wasn't aired in America, but in the town of Claremont, South Africa, a man named E.H. Stephan either picked up the signal on shortwave radio or received a report of it. Stephan worked for a service that monitored broadcasts that sent news of POWs to family members. He filled out a card with information about the broadcast. Louis, the card said, was a POW in an Axis camp. Remember, it's the Allied powers and the Axis powers. So Allied is the U.S. side and Axis is the Japanese side. Stephan stapled a transcript of the radio message to the card. He addressed it using the contact information typed in the message, misunderstood as Louise Vancerini, 2028 Gramercy Street, Torrance, California. He dropped the card in the mail. Thanks to the mistaken address and the severe delays of the wartime mail, the card would wander the world for months. In January 1945, it would turn up in Trona, a crossroads in the California desert. It would be the end of January, nearly 3.5 months after the broadcast, when someone in Trona would pick up the letter, scribble Try Torrance on the outside, and mail it on. And we will pause there.